Hello everyone, and welcome to my new podcast mini-series, A Penny for Your Thoughts on Sustainability. I have guests from all over the world and we'll be talking about their thoughts on sustainability and how they do their part to make the world a greener place. Sam, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today. We're doing a series of podcasts now focusing on the issue of sustainability and what that means, particularly for New Zealand, but also on a more global scale where we're seeing the key trends going in the next few years and what we can best do to make sure we're positioned as a country to meet our obligations in that drive to be more sustainable. So if you wouldn't mind, if you just give us a quick introduction of who you are and what you're currently doing and your role in this area, and then we'll start going through the agenda item. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Steve. My name's Sam Archer. I'm a technical director at the New Zealand Green Building Council. My role really is to look after all of the sustainability rating certification tools that we run here at Green Building Council. So we have Star, which we use for commercial buildings, Homestar for residential, and then we've got some other rating tools for existing buildings as well. And we also run the Nabers, effectively energy performance certificate rating for E as well, which maybe we'll come on to later, but we're hoping to get mandated by government through compulsory building disclosure. So I guess, my role is very much around the running of those standards, but we at Green Building Council don't think that voluntary green building standards are enough by themselves. And really we use those green building standards as a way of infiltrating government and getting government to make mandatory typically through the building code, the stuff that our clients are the leaders, they're doing the leadership stuff. We can then go with those clients to government, which we do regularly, into Wellington, and say, look, here are the 10% of the market that are doing the great stuff. You need to make this mandatory for everyone. And so, a lot of my time is working with, MB and other regulators and brands and others around technical standards and trying to improve the way that we do things in New Zealand.
Okay. And what was your background prior to joining the Green Building Council?
So I started off my career as a building services engineer 20 odd years ago, far too long than I care to remember. I got a bit bored with fan coil unit schedules and lighting schedules, and I was more interested in strategic stuff. And sort of around about 3 or 4 years into my career, BREEAM, which is the equivalent of Green Star in the UK, really took off. And so it really, for the last 15, 16, 17 years of my career, I've done building sustainability stuff. So strategic advice to clients around things like sustainability strategies for, housing master plans. We worked together, Steve, on about that on an energy strategy for university here in New Zealand. So that kind of work has been my bread and butter prior to joining the Green Building Council here. Okay,
excellent. Anything else that you think is sort of gives good background about you and your role?
Yeah, I guess, having worked in sustainability in buildings for a long time, what's emerged for me is a kind of way of working. And, the sustainability in the built environment industry, for want of a better word, ranges from the kind of zealots, as I would call them, people that want the most extreme standards right through. I guess people like me who I'm much more interested. What I've become much more interested in over the years is, instead of working on those kind of very niche, super sustainable buildings, which is great fun. You get a building that is net zero carbon. It's got tons of PV on the roof and it's done all sorts of stuff, and that's brilliant. But you've actually got to work with the mainstream industry. The 90% of the industry and help them lift their game bit by painful bit. And it's harder to do it that way, but actually that's the way we actually get meaningful change, really, rather than a few little niche buildings. So I guess that's what interests me now. Yeah,
it's not. I mean, it is. I think I'd agree with you there. It's nice to see that there are people trying to push the envelope to some extent with what they're doing and what they're achieving. Yeah. But you are right. The bigger issue that we face in New Zealand, but also globally, is getting the other people that aren't so focused to lift their game to a point where it's actually making a difference. Yeah. And that, I think, has been the biggest stumbling block up to now, is that there's a lot of hysteresis in the system. Doesn't want to move very fast. Yeah. And the speed of change probably hasn't been anywhere near fast enough for what we're trying to achieve. And we're seeing that with the outcomes we're starting to see, like the wildfires across Europe this year. I mean, that's like unheard of climate impact that's demonstrating that we're not moving quick enough. enough, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, we saw that with the H1 changes that came through recently, where they had to delay them 6 months because the industry wasn't ready.
Yeah.
And New Zealand has a very long tail of, particularly in house building, of how to say this politely. I mean, for example, what brands show is that maybe a quarter to a third of homes in New Zealand are built by builders that only build a few, 2 or 3 houses a year. So they're pretty low tech, low kind of technical experience kind of people building a lot of the houses, and we've got a huge amount of work to do to bring them up to speed with kind of modern methods of building high performance to what they do.
Yeah, I mean, must admit, I did encounter that when we were looking initially a few years ago at getting a house built ourselves, and I was asking for the windows to be thermally broken, double glazed units. Yeah. And the guy just looked at me and said, "Why do you want to spend that much money on windows? It's a waste of money. There's no benefit." And he's like, "No, really, there is. Honestly, I'd really like to. Well, I don't know." And it is that kind of not really understanding the full implications of some of the decisions. And I think there is a big education piece, not just for the builders, but for also the people that's buying the houses, the people that's moving into the offices. Everybody needs to understand what the real reason behind these things is, rather than it's a nice to have. Because I think there's a bit too much of that going on at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, having said that, Steve, I think what I was going to mention is on the other side of things. I think over sort of 20 plus years of doing green buildings, I think the industry has sometimes pushed things that there's a bit of sort of assuming something is better just because it's seen to be a green thing to do. And I think the onus is on us that work in sustainable buildings to actually provide the proper scientific evidence that what we're saying is better for the environment or lower carbon or going to make your house cheaper to run, that we actually have that evidence. And sometimes we don't.
It looks like it's a good idea, but we don't have the evidence to back it up. Sometimes you're right. Yeah, I do agree with that. Let's just broaden things out a little bit. From your point of view, what do you think are the key things that's currently holding us back in that area of being more sustainable as a country?
There's a few there. One would be cost. So, it's a lot more expensive to build in New Zealand than it is in other countries. That's just come out. We've just done talking about evidence, we've just done a big study on looking at retrofit proposals for houses here, deep retrofits listing older homes. And, to be perfectly blunt, the cost benefit there is looking not very good, just because it's really expensive to put in things like, retrofit double glazing and, insulation, things like that. So that's a problem.
Is that when you're doing that cost benefit, are you looking at just the cost of the building versus the energy saving, or are you in fact factoring in things like the impact on health?
Yeah, we're including health. Yeah, even with health. Yeah, even with health.
Oh, right.
Partly the problem, Steve, is that New Zealand houses are generally underheated. I think the average from heat was 16 degrees or something on average. And what tends to happen is you get a lot of take back. So you put a lot of insulation in the house and people use the same amount of energy, but they just heat to a higher temperature. So that gives you health benefits, obviously, but it doesn't give you any energy benefit. So yeah, that's a little bit problematic. I think there's a bit of a sort of we've always done it that way kind of mentality in New Zealand. So, I get that quite often, or used to, not so much anymore, with Homestar, where we talk to an architect or a builder and say we're requiring X, and they would say, "Oh, well, we don't do it. We don't do it like that here." And we say, "Well, that's exactly why we're asking you to do it differently, is because how we do it here is resulting in mold and damp and unhealthy houses. So we need to change." That's a bit of a problem.
Do you think is that down to a lack of understanding of what the implications of those changes are? Do you think, or is there some other factor that's saying we're not going to change because X?
It's a difficult one. I mean, just another anecdote. But I hear from I'm not going to say who, but a big organisation that builds a lot of houses. They'll often say the architect designs the right thing on a drawing, but then they turn up to site and realise the builder's just built it how they've always built it. Because it's the sort of mentality of you don't necessarily follow plans, and we don't do as-built drawings here. There's not that kind of follow-through in terms of making sure that the things were actually built according to the plans. That sort of attitude.
That's a little bit frustrating, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's a lot to overcome there.
I mean, do you think? I mean, one of the things that I've sort of seen is that politics is playing quite a big role in this as well. That there's a lot of, I guess, vested interests in keeping things with the status quo. That it's well understood and the costs can be well managed and all that kind of thing. And the change is a risk to that scenario.
Yeah, I think I'm potentially going to get myself in hot water here.
Well,
Steve, you're putting words in my mouth. But I think
that,
that there is a little bit of a, how can I say it? New Zealand has that reputation as of being very low corruption, and it is. It's one of the least corrupt places in the world. But on the other hand, it's a very small place, which means that everyone knows everyone, and
Yep.
we have very small numbers of players and a lot of markets, which means there is a bit of a sort of back to that sort of comment about that we've always done that we always do it this way. I think part of that is explained by this kind of small numbers of people. Everyone knows everyone. There's a bit of a revolving door between some of the big institutions, the MBs and the brands and but a little bit by bit, we're chipping away at that and making the case at Green Building Council that we do need to change, and it's starting to work.
Are you seeing people starting to adopt things that are being used elsewhere in the world over in New Zealand? Because one of the things I've encountered personally is that there's a reluctance to use something if it's not been proven in New Zealand.
Yeah, well, I mean, we saw that, didn't we, with the GIB crisis that we had, plasterboard crisis that we had last year.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of the word GIB till I came here, and then suddenly you find that instead of using the word plasterboard on a drawing, all the architects have put GIB, which is a proprietary product.
Yes. Yep.
I've been doing the Green Building Council job for 7 years, and the last 2 or 3 years has seen a massive accelerated uptake in understanding and appreciation of higher performance buildings. And I think we're starting to see, maybe we'll come on to this, but there's been an emerging interest in mass timber, for example. And I was out for dinner with a group of builders, different builders, as part of a event we were doing in Wellington last year. And I just at the dinner table, I asked the question, how many of you are working on mass timber buildings? And I thought 1 or 2 of them might say, yeah, we're doing one. All of them said every building we're doing at the moment is mass timber.
Do you think there's any risk in going that route, like converting away from concrete to mass timber as the only solution?
Well, hopefully it's not the only solution, Steve. So I wouldn't support that. I think
it's part of the answer.
Yeah, I think back to that design experience question you mentioned, it does require things like proper fire design. It requires the people to know what they're doing with it. But I think those issues are surmountable.
Yeah. I mean it certainly seems to be quite a good solution a lot of the time to go for timber rather than for the concrete. But I think the other thing that I'm seeing a lot more of overseas than I am here is the repurposing of existing buildings.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah.
To deal with that embedded carbon issue, and I think there's potentially some lessons to learn in that space here in New Zealand.
Yeah, I mean it's happening. I mean, I just went on a tour last week or 2 weeks ago of Auckland University's B201 building, which is it's a mixture of it's a reuse of an existing concrete building with a mass timber foyer that they've added on the front. I can't remember the statistics, but I think they were pointing to sort of like a 50% plus reduction in embodied carbon from reusing that building.
I think that's one of the things going forward that we need to make sure is part of the design agenda is looking at repurposing. And if repurposing isn't possible with the existing building, making sure whatever you're designing has that flexibility that it can be reused again for another purpose in the future.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean that's a big emerging buzzword in sustainability globally. I wouldn't say it's kind of coming here, which is the circular economy, circular kind of thinking, and exactly as you say, is the building demountable at the end of its life? We've got this emerging idea of building passports where big elements like timber trusses would have a digital record of its strength and the material where it came from, so that future structural engineers could make use of those. All of that stuff is very on the cards at the moment.
Well, that could all of that information, if you're doing it right, could be put into the model that you create for the building, couldn't it? That's where you start to connect all of those dots, and that sort of information library becomes a more real thing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so I think it's emerging, Steve. I think we're seeing the design industry start to come forward with some of these better practices for sure.
Yeah. And I think there's a small piece of work to do there with the clients as well, giving them a better understanding of what that circular economy means in their context as well. I mean, is there anything in the Green Building Council's agenda to do that education piece? Is that something that you guys would be looking to do into the future?
Do you mean specifically around circular buildings, Steve?
Yeah, around the embedded carbon and how to manage that particular impact.
Oh, definitely. So we've been doing a lot of work on embodied carbon the last 2 or 3 years. We've done a range of webinars. I mean, the big thing that we're doing on embodied carbon, Steve, is standardizing, because one of the big issues that we found over the last 3, 4, 5 years is you give the same building to 3 different consultants and ask them to calculate the embodied emissions, you get 3 completely different answers.
Yeah.
And that's not because they're idiots. It's because there hasn't been until recently a real standardized way of saying what it is. Do you include the HVAC systems in the calculation? Do you include the lifts? Do you include whatever? And over what life? Do you assume for the building? And all those different key assumptions result in different answers. We published the Green Star embodied carbon methodology last year, and that's now. And most of the industry is using that as a sort of standardized way of doing the calculation.
So then you can make real comparisons between alternative solutions, can't you?
That's right. So when one building says they're 200 tons of carbon and the other says 300, then hopefully it's comparing apples with apples.
Yep.
And we, off the back of that, we produced quite a detailed embodied carbon calculator, and we've been running webinars every 6 weeks to 8 weeks. Not webinars, sorry, embodied carbon masterclasses where we're in person. We have 20 people in a room using the calculator. We've sold out every single one of those that we've been doing for the last 3, 4, 5 months, which just shows how much interest there is in embodied carbon in the consultant industry.
So that's predominantly consultants that's heading that class then?
It would be architects, engineers, structural engineers, QSs. Interestingly, I think QSs are emerging as sort of the type of consultant that should be doing these kind of calculations because the quantities and that kind of information.
Yeah. I think that also needs to be part of the cost planning, doesn't it? That that's going to have a cost impact, and understanding the alternatives and what those impacts are is something that the QS is probably well placed to review.
Absolutely, yeah. Nick Carman at Mott McDonald's has got this really, there's the project manager QS kind of triangle. What is it? Cost, quality, and time. And he adds a fourth point to the pyramid, which is carbon, quality, cost, and time are the things you're trying to balance on a project.
Yep. Okay. So, I mean, where is the Green Building Council heading over the next short to medium term and then long term? What is it you're driving towards for the industry right now?
Yeah, great question. So our CEO Andrew, what he always says is that he'd like to do ourselves out of a job. We want to get to a point where everyone's doing this, so that we don't have to kind of cajole everyone to do it.
Yep.
I think the reality is that you probably be aware that MB have got a program called Building for Climate Change, which is about effectively getting new buildings down to near zero carbon by the kind of early 2030s.
Yep.
So I think with luck and a following wind, and hopefully the new government committing to that program, we will see the building code requiring low carbon new buildings. We will have kind of won that battle, hopefully. There'll still be a lot of work to do with industry to help them, back to your point about education, to help them understand how to get to that point.
Yep.
What I think will then happen is the focus will then turn much more towards existing buildings. How to get all of our existing stock to be high performing as well.
Yep.
So although Andrew says we want to do ourselves out of a job, I think we've probably got 20-30 years of work.
I would say so. You've probably got a job for life in real terms to get things, because there is still a lot of work to be done, as you say.
Yeah.
And I mean, so the steps to get to that point, obviously we've got to start to build new stock in the better way and make sure that one of the things I see quite a lot is that life of buildings is relatively short.
Yeah,
it's sort of 15 to 20 years life expectancy, maybe 30 years.
Yeah.
Whereas if you go back a few centuries, you've got buildings that were built to last a lifetime and multiple lifetimes, in fact, in some cases. And I think one of the things that we need to start doing is building longer term than we are, and there is a cost implication for that for the first people that build the building, but over the life of the building you obviously deal with the embodied carbon a lot better, but you also provide an asset that's got a longer life. Financing it is probably going to be easier because it's going to last for longer, all of those other things that sit alongside it. Do you think that's likely in New Zealand?
I would like to push back on that assumption a bit, Steve.
Okay.
I'll tell you why. Because my experience is that buildings don't get demolished because they've reached the end of their durable life. They get demolished because they're the wrong building in the wrong place. So if anything, for me, that's an excuse to build lighter. If you kind of acknowledge that we are a sort of society that kind of builds and knocks down and builds again in a different way, then I don't know. You're right. There's a balance.
If you build a building that, I mean, obviously, ultimate flexibility is very expensive.
Yeah, that's right.
But if you can design a building in a way that it can have multiple purposes with minimal required change, then you deal with that in another way. I do understand what you're saying, that sometimes the building's the wrong building in the wrong place, and then you may not have a choice. But I think we also tend to design very, very bespoke buildings that can only ever have one purpose. And,
Yes.
and that's not helping us in the sustainability issue.
I mean, I had exactly that debate with one of my my favourite projects I ever worked on was a 3,000 home development for the University of Cambridge, and that was mainly 3, 4, 5-story residential blocks, at least initial phase, and we were really trying to make them build those buildings out of timber for the lower embodied carbon. And they said, we're an 800-year-old institution. We build buildings to last. We want to build them out of concrete because then they'll have 150, 200-year life. And they pointed to some of their buildings that are 300, 400 years old. But I mean, my point back to them was, but how many buildings have you built and demolished over the 3, 4, 500? The ones that have lasted, of course, they've lasted because they're still here. But I think the reality is a lot of their newer buildings haven't lasted, and they have demolished them for different reasons.
Different reasons, yeah. I mean, look, there is. I mean, I think it's worth asking that question, though, isn't it? I think that there are multiple answers to that question, but if you don't ask the question, then you're potentially missing out on an opportunity to have a proper, a decent impact on the design process.
I need to find the statistic, because somebody once told me that the average life of a office building in Canary Wharf, the City of London, is 10 years. And
that's quite hard to believe that it's only 10. I mean, maybe it is, but I mean, Canary Wharf has been offices since the early 90s.
Yeah, I know, but I think the point that they were trying to make, and I'm sure, I don't know whether the 10-year figure is right, but the point that I was making was that in one point of the economic cycle, 10-story building makes economic sense, but then 10 years later, it makes sense for it to be a 15 or 20-story building. So they,
and it's difficult to add another 10 stories onto an existing building.
Exactly.
You pay a lot for some foundations if you're going to plan that.
That's right.
Very true. Very true. So outside of New Zealand, is there anything you think that's holding the construction industry back from your perspective that you see as being an issue that we need to address more globally?
You mean globally?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, back to the embodied carbon thing, Steve. We did a study a couple of years ago with ThinkStep, which looked at what would need to change in order for us to get to a zero carbon embodied carbon. And I think the reality is that the technologies we need, things like zero carbon concrete and zero carbon steel, are a long way away. Mm-hmm. So zero carbon steel would require kind of hydrogen type facilities, that kind of thing. We're starting to see some research around zero carbon concretes, but I think that there's a big technology change needed to get from typically you might be able to get about 30, 40, 50% reduction in embodied carbon from things like moving to mass timber. The concrete industry here in New Zealand is looking at 30, 40% reductions over the next 10, 15 years from technologies they're bringing in, like cement replacement, stuff like that.
Okay.
But to truly decarbonize completely requires a real technology shift. Yeah, so there's research going on into that kind of thing at the moment.
Okay. Is there anything in that space where do you think, because New Zealand has a reputation for being very innovative and coming up with good solutions, is there anything happening in New Zealand at the moment in that space, specifically that we're trying to come up with a solution for?
That's a great question. Not at a really kind of global level, Steve.
Right.
But I mean, we could probably point to our cement industry and say our cement and concrete is lower carbon than a lot of comparable countries. Because we have tyres and waste timber in the Golden Bay Cement Factory, as an example. But I don't think we're doing anything particularly advanced here.
Is there an opportunity? Do you think there is an opportunity for New Zealand to come up with some solutions? I mean, it's a country that's come up with some solutions to problems in the past. Yeah. Is that something we could drive? From the very smart people that we've got in the country to come up with some bright ideas about how we could do that?
Possibly. I mean, definitely there's some open questions there around things like, do we continue to make aluminium here? And we make one of the lowest carbon aluminiums in the world, thanks to the smelter down at TY. Mm-hmm. Mass timber, we've got a huge timber industry here, haven't we? But we export logs, not engineered.
We tend to, I think, if I'm right, we tend to export the vast majority of our timber overseas and then take the process stuff back.
Yeah. It's pretty nuts, isn't it?
It seems like there's an opportunity there.
Yeah.
But
I think the reality, what I hear from the timber industry, is that there might be one plant in Germany that produces essentially almost all of the mass timber for 500 million people in the European Union kind of thing, whereas the size of the market here is so small, it's very hard for industry to scale up.
Yeah, understood. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the challenges we face a lot across a lot of areas, is that we are a very small economy.
Yeah.
And to some extent, we are punching well above our weight in the way that we do stuff.
Yeah.
But that economy size does limit what we can actually do.
That's right.
To a large extent, unfortunately. Is there any other things you think that we should be, outside of the construction industry specifically, if there are other things that we need to be looking at to help reduce our impact on the environment around us?
Well, the big elephant in the room is transport, right?
Mm-hmm.
From a personal carbon footprint point of view, transport is the really big one, and a lot of that's down to city planning. As kind of, we dabble a little bit of that in Green Building Council, but New Zealand cities, in the same way that American and Australian ones have been built up very much around the car. So we've got a job to do to kind of, for want of a better word, re-engineer our cities much more around public transport.
Make them more walkable. I think that's
Yeah. You've probably seen that whole thing around 15-minute cities and how that's become a conspiracy theory that we're trying to,
Well, yeah, I do like that idea. If you look at what Christchurch is doing with the east frame and the other residential frames they're building around the outside of the city centre, that's what they're, in some ways, that's what they're trying to achieve. They're doing it for multiple reasons, to try and activate the city centre and bring more people in to make it more viable as a city. But it also means that you're getting the situation where people can walk to work.
That's right.
And in the summer, you walk across Hagley Park. It's not a bad walk.
Lovely. Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Because the conspiracy theory is kind of complaining that you're taking away my choice. You're taking away my choice to drive. But actually, there's the opposite. You're adding more choices. You're saying, well, you could drive, but actually, there's also walking and cycling, and it's about offering more choice, not less.
Yeah, not less. Yeah, and I think that's, again, there's an agenda there somewhere, isn't there?
Yeah,
probably.
That's right. I think New Zealand will always be a country of driving, and so I think EVs are clearly going to be
there was a huge controversy, wasn't there, at one point around the additional tax on people having utes. That made the national news for quite a long time, and there was protests and all sorts about it. And it's that choice thing. We're not, you're not saying you can't have them, but they do have an impact, and we all need to take responsibility for that. And I think that personal responsibility is something that is key to us actually getting to a point where we've reached a point of balance, because we're out of balance at the moment, and we need to get back to a point where we're in balance, and personal responsibility is a big part of that, I think.
Yeah. People have to accept the need to change, Steve, and that's a slow process. But I think it could track the sentiments of New Zealanders, and the belief that we should be doing something about climate change just goes up every year. And it's now the vast majority of New Zealanders think we should do something. The tricky bit is when it actually comes to changing
personal choices,
personal lifestyle. Yeah.
Do you think that EVs? I think EVs have a place to play in, or a part to play in this resolution of the issue we've got. But there's a lot of controversy around them and the embodied carbon in building an EV, which is predominantly down to the batteries. Have you got any view on where we're going with the battery technology? Do you think that there is a longer term solution there?
Yeah, even with current technologies, EVs over their life are lower carbon, and there have been tons of studies now that show that they're lower carbon, even in countries with mainly coal electricity generation. In New Zealand, there's no excuse, because the majority of our energy generation is renewable. It's hydro and wind and so on, and so the payback of the extra carbon from the battery would be, I don't have the exact figures, but if not many thousand kilometers, you'd pay that back.
Yeah,
I think the issue in New Zealand we've got is that currently I think we're around sort of 2 plus 2.5 on average cars per household, and a lot of that's just around to the fact that there's so little choice around public transport, and
certainly when you get out of the main centres, there is no public transport.
Yeah, that's right, and that's fair enough. I don't think any of us that advocate for public transport kind of think that everyone needs to be taking the bus everywhere. That's not the point. But as a lot of us do live in cities and do live on public transport routes, then I think maybe we need to move from 2.5 cars per household to one. And that one gets used at the weekend to go and do the Bunnings trip, and most of the time you are so that's the kind of change I think that we need to see. But that one car that's left in the driveway, I think that does need to be an EV, because we can't continue burning petrol if we're going to meet our carbon targets.
Yeah. And one of the other issues I've heard discussed is that if we do convert to EVs, then we're going to have an issue with the capacity of our current electrical infrastructure.
I think that's solvable, though. I mean, I think what will emerge is kind of time of use pricing, and
Yep.
you probably won't be plugging in the EV at 7 p.m. on a winter's evening when we've got up on a kind of peak grid constraints. They'll be programmed to come on in the middle of the night when there's less demand and so on. So I think that's solvable.
Yeah.
And actually, with grid to vehicle, what is the right term? The idea that your battery could feed back into the house. I think what will emerge is the battery in the car ending up being part about stabilizing the grid.
Yeah, that is something I've looked at what we can do with our house. We've got solar panels on the roof of the house now.
Yeah.
So that's photovoltaic. So we're doing the power generation from that. And what I try to do is make sure I'm charging the car when it's on a sunny day, so that electricity is not coming off the grid then.
It's being used. Right.
And it's kind of that sort of, I guess, planning the way you use your power is going to become a more part of what we do in order to make sure we use the power as efficiently as we can. And every grid has a limit, and we need to work within those limits. And so long as we understand what they are, I think we can make it work quite well.
That's right. I mean, so for the last 2, 3, 4 years, Transpower have been suggesting that New Zealand needs to double its grid capacity over the next 30 years, by sort of 2050.
Yeah.
So the question is, where is all that power going to come from? Well, it's probably going to come from wind and solar. I think the concern that a lot of us have is that particularly wind is going to be pushed back by the people who don't want a wind farm on their in view of their house and the Wairarapa or wherever, or offshore wind schemes. I think doubling the current capacity of electricity generation in New Zealand is not going to be easy. I think there'll be a lot of pushback. I was going to
say, what do you think to the idea of, I guess, I don't know if legislating is the right word, but it making solar panels on the roof of new builds a requirement, so that every building has a small element? I mean, I'm not saying you're going to get all of your power from solar panels,
no,
but domestically, if you design it correctly, you get the vast majority of power through that solution.
I'm on the fence at the moment about this, Steve, because my concern with solar is that it's not producing the power when we need it, which is at 7 p.m. on a winter's evening.
Mm-hmm.
So if we did install huge amounts of solar, we're going to end up with some of the problems that they've got in Germany and California, where they're producing way too much at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Having said all that, we've got to find the power somehow.
Yeah.
So
do you think the issue of it being at the wrong time is down to the way that we generally tend to use the power, and that there might be an opportunity, like, for example, you put your washing machine on when you get home at night, and you put your dishwasher on at night, and you do these other things at night. There's no reason why you can't set them up so they go during the day when the sun's shining and you're using the power from the solar panels. It's and your hot water cylinder, you'll have a bath at night and then it will heat up overnight, which is cheaper electricity. But again, if you're getting the electricity for free by using solar panels, then do the timing in a different way. That might be a better solution.
Yeah, the problem isn't a 24-hour kind of timing issue. It's a winter-summer thing. So the PV produces 2, 3, 4 times more energy in January than it does in July. Yeah, and so and it's not just 7 p.m. on a winter's evening, but we use considerably more power over the winter months, mainly because of residential heating. And so if we're going to go for solar in a big way, then we're going to need to find a way of storing all that excess energy produced in the summer and then using it in the winter. So it's going to require big storage, which is what that government Lake Onslow scheme was all about.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think there's a role for solar, but I need more convincing that.
I'm not suggesting it's the only solution, but it might be, again, like a lot of things, it might be part of the solution.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I think that there's a lot of the time we get frozen because we think we've got to find one thing that's going to fix everything.
One silver bullet, that's right. We actually need everything.
It needs to be a combination of different things. We need to build more efficient houses so we don't need as much energy to keep them heated, and we don't need as much energy to light them, and then it reduces the load on the grid. And then that's kind of the way that we need to think about it. It's got to be my view is it's got to be a more holistic approach to the way we design buildings and plan to use the energy. And that's one of the things that I really enjoyed earlier on in my career is I worked for Atelier 10 with Patrick Bellew and his team, and his approach to design was very, very different to most other all other engineers that I've worked with, to be fair, which was that that you've got to think of the building as a complete entity, not as a shell with some services inside it. And if you start to think about it like that and start to think about how you can make the building fabric work with you, not against you, and all of those things, you get a much better outcome for the project.
Yeah.
And I think that more holistic approach is definitely going to be something that we need to see more of in the way that we approach design.
Totally agree. Absolutely agree. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Is there any sort of emerging technologies that you're seeing that you think might well be something that's good for us to focus on? I mean, the hydrogen fuel cells keep coming up in conversations. Do you think that they've got a place to play?
Short answer, no. Yeah. Well, not in buildings. I mean, maybe in other locations potentially. I mean, so the original fuel cells were based on this idea that you'd put gas in them and then reform the gas into hydrogen and put it in a fuel cell. So it became a sort of more efficient combined heat and power.
Yep.
I personally think that what we're now seeing is a complete move away in buildings from gas or fossil fuels generally, Steve.
Yep.
In discussions I have with building services HVAC engineers here in New Zealand, they say we're just not building new buildings with gas boilers anymore. So I think it's not a new technology, but I think heat pumps are the emerging kind of heating technology, and we'll see a move away from gas califorts in houses, and we'll see a move away from big gas boilers in commercial buildings. I think the one technology thing they do need to solve with heat pumps is high temperature heat pumps, particularly for replacement. So
your COP drops right off on those high temperatures, which is it almost becomes an electric boiler, a 1-to-1, which is
that's right.
It's really not a good option.
Yes, so I mean, I think it's emerging. I think we're getting. We'll get a high temperature, high COP heat pump eventually. I hope. I think I was going to mention. I mean, again, it's technology that's now fully there, but I mean, it's taken a while to sort of reach fruition, which is EC/DC fans. Which is sort of like basic. You're mentioning some of the sort of design consultancies that were around 20 years ago. I worked for Max Fordham in London, and they were really big exponents of naturally ventilated buildings. But I think once you get really efficient fans and heat recovery, then suddenly it does become better probably to have mechanical ventilation.
Well, I think the issue that we found with natural ventilation as a solution is it's much more difficult to control the internal environment, and that if you've got comfort is all about control. It's not the temperature; it's the variation that causes a lot of discomfort. And if you've got a system that allows you to keep a very stable temperature with minimal energy input, then that's probably the best way to go.
Well, you can't do heat recovery on natural ventilation. That's very cool too. So
no, that's very true. That's very true.
And if you look at the kind of the real pioneers in very low energy buildings, Passive House. Passive House has been a proponent of mechanically ventilated buildings for 20 plus 30 years. And I think that there's been a bit of a change in kind of understanding of that over the.
They seem to be getting quite prevalent over here now. Passive House seems to be becoming more and more. I mean, even Pioneer is starting to look at that as a solution, which is
they've just built. That's right. They've just built,
which is really good.
That's right. Yeah. And again, it comes down to understanding, because it's not just lots of insulation. It's understanding all those issues around thermal bridging, and we're doing a lot of work with architects now on how do you design a balcony that's thermally broken, because traditionally in New Zealand you'd have a concrete that goes all the way from inside to outside, and Passive House wouldn't let you do that because that's a horrible thermal bridge. And so teaching architects on how to design better is part of what we're doing.
Well, that's obviously there needs to be some change, but I think there's lots of opportunities for change as well. I think that's one of the things I'm very excited by, actually, that there's a lot of chances to do something better, and the markets seems to be much more interested in that as well over the last couple of years. I would say.
Yeah. I mean, same with LED lighting, isn't it? I mean, when I started my career, everyone was concerned with lighting controls and PIR sensors and all the rest of it. But now, really, to be honest, with LED lighting, it becomes such an insignificant, amount of energy in a building. The only issue with that is that there are some instances where you can be overlit because you think that the lighting's so low energy, we've got extra fittings and it doesn't matter. The reality is you then end up with an uncomfortable inside the space because it's so bright. But that's a minor issue in relation, I guess. Is there anything? Who do you see in New Zealand as being the key players for us to become more sustainable as a country? So that goes back to the economies of scale thing, Steve. So one of the things that we've been very successful with is working with Kāinga Ora over the last 3 or 4 years. and they do Homestar on absolutely everything. And I really sort of tip my hat to Kyangora because they've been transformative in that way. You need you need the really big clients to say we're going to do this en masse. Back to my original point around lifting everyone's game, not just a few niche people. So it does require some of those big clients like Kyangora to lift the game. We're now starting to see some sort of private clients. Again, I won't name names for confidential reasons, but there are big New Zealand companies that supermarkets, for example, that are starting to commit to building their buildings in a much more sustainable way, and that has ripple effects through the industry.
I was just thinking that if you look back to the UK, when we started changing the building code in the UK to make buildings more energy efficient, the way that was eventuated was you had government bodies like the different departments saying we're only going to move into a building if it meets this standard.
Exactly.
And what that did to the market was when the market said, well, we've got to achieve that standard, and then it kind of filtered out to everybody. Because suddenly that became the gold standard that you wanted to work in.
Right.
And
that's right.
and it allowed you to charge a premium for your leases and all the rest of it, and it kind of drove itself that way. And I think that's going to be the case here in New Zealand as well, isn't it? You'll see.
So we've had that for the last 2 or 3 years with the previous government required Green Star on all projects over 9 million. So it's going to be interesting to see whether the new government commits to that, keeps that commitment going. The other thing that they were working on before the change of government was a requirement for energy performance certificates on commercial buildings. So a Nabers rating effectively on point of sale or lease. So I can see the current government pushing that through as well. The new government. So you have to in your lobby have a label on the building.
Right. Is that something that you see happening domestically as well? That you end up with an energy rating for your house?
They're definitely the first cab off the rank is commercial buildings. I think MB have it on their radar. I won't push it any more than that, but I think that there's an understanding that maybe we should move to residential ones, but that's not currently on the agenda.
Because you get it. I mean, you get it on all your appliances now. What the star rating is.
You do. Yeah, that's right.
It's not much of a step to go from there to saying my house is 4 stars or 5 stars or whatever it may be. I mean, I can see that. I do think that happens overseas in some locations. I think they've started to do that in the UK. I think is the case.
Oh no, that's been around 2006 and throughout the European Union. They required all European states to have energy labelling of all buildings. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So, I mean, it will come eventually, wouldn't it, I would say. I mean, you did say at the start you wanted to talk a little bit about Nabers. Nabers ratings.
So, Nabers started off in Australia, and it's a really simple scheme. It's just you take the energy bills of a commercial building and an office typically, although they've moved into other building types, but it started off in offices. You take the energy bill, you divide it by the floor space. It gives you your kilowatt hours per square metre of energy use, and then that gives you a star rating from 1 to 6. In Australia, they very quickly went to all government buildings requiring it. New Zealand did that 2 to 3 years ago. I can't remember exactly when, but a couple of years ago. We've gone from 7 years ago, we were doing 20-25 buildings a year rated under Nabers. This year we'll probably achieve 150 large commercial office buildings rated under the Nabers scheme. And
so is the rating like a post-design thing that you rate it once it's built?
It's generally for existing office buildings. So, an assessor would go in, get the bills, look at the wiring diagram of the building and make sure they're capturing all of the different loads properly, and apply online. It's a very simple rating. Do you think
that there would be a benefit to maybe having a target rating for a new build? Are you seeing that happening at all?
Well, it's funny you should say that. So when MBF started consulting, the last document they put out around this Building for Climate Change scheme had a sort of dummy energy rating label on the back of the document they put out, which suggested that the code would also, when you apply for building consent, you'd have to do an energy model of the building. That energy model would have a sort of predict what the energy consumption would be and give it an A to G rating kind of thing. So I think that could come out as part of the building code update.
So I'm seeing that in the UK in particular, the consenting process has become a lot more work around embodied carbon, but also around building energy usage. And there's a lot of stuff to be done at a very early stage in the consenting process now, which has sort of prolonging that front end design piece quite a lot.
That's what MB is proposing. They're proposing that you'd have to do an embodied carbon and operational carbon assessment of the building for building consent. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that is going to drive a lot of change, isn't it? Because
It is.
and I mean, is there an indication of what the targets are going to be for the buildings?
They did publish some operational targets in 2020, so a long time ago, 3 years ago. In conversations I have with MB, they say they're very much a placeholder.
Yeah.
So they've still got a lot of work to do to actually set the real targets as they emerge. And also, of course, it requires the new minister and MB, the new government, to approve that change. So so kind of wait and see. Yeah.
Okay, that's very good. Is there anything else you think that'd be relevant to this conversation you'd like to bring up now?
Yeah, you were asking about sort of who are the key organisations, Steve.
Yep.
The other one I haven't mentioned is the finance and investor community. So very much for commercial buildings, that's what we're seeing as being the big driver. So we have constant meetings with banks here where banks say, we've all our investors are requiring us to make sure that our lending is sustainable. New Zealand introduced something called this is a bit of a mouthful, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. Which is essentially a requirement for large organisations with a large investment portfolio to report on their climate risks. So that's driving the big banks to kind of think about, the money that I'm loaning on this commercial building, am I loaning on a commercial building that's badly designed, high carbon, is going to need to be torn down in 10 years' time because it's a white elephant, it's got gas boilers and all the rest of it. So that is driving an enormous amount of the change. And then similarly with the large scale investor-owned property companies, their shareholders are saying the future is sustainable. What the hell are you doing? Running this building portfolio. What are you doing with your buildings? So we're seeing that as a big driver here.
Okay. I mean, I think one of the things I'm seeing is people starting to focus on things like condition assessments of building stock to understand exactly what they've got so that they can then make a plan to do whatever necessary improvements. One other one, sort of kind of not really a left field question, but kind of outside there a little bit, is we're obviously moving to a society that is heavily reliant on data, which results in lots of data centers. And they consume huge amounts of power. Have you had any view on what we need to do to make that a more sustainable piece? Because I can't see a way that we're going to reduce the data requirement.
It's only going to increase, isn't it?
It's only going to increase, and and it's all, a lot of it is now cloud based. So you're no longer having servers in buildings anymore. It's all going out into the ether somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. I think I was reading recently. I keep meaning to do some more research into this, but I understand that Microsoft completely blown their carbon targets out of the water because they've invested in ChatGPT. All the kind of server farms they're having to do for AI completely blown their carbon budgets, which is kind of funny. Look, I think most of the big companies that are building data centers, they're onto it, from what I can see, and they're tending to build data centers where there's low carbon electricity. And actually, that's one of the reasons why New Zealand is being earmarked for a lot of data. I think government has been working on trying to attract data centers here. There's talk of one or a big server farm going down in Dunedin, I think, or somewhere in Ireland because of the access to hydroelectricity, for example.
And I think that's kind of sitting around with the aluminium smelter and whether or not that's going to be ongoing, because there's a big power supply there that could potentially be used for that data center. I mean, I think the risk for New Zealand is, we've already talked that without that there's a risk on the size of the network. If we start bringing in more data centers, we're going to add to that problem.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think that's part of something that is a much bigger issue there about how we deal with that data management, because it's a global issue that we can only be a small part of, but it's something we do need to focus on because it is going to become a bigger and bigger problem.
Totally right. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to bring up today?
Question. We've talked about a lot, Steve, haven't we?
We have. Yeah.
No, I think sort of maybe a passing shot, which is just that, with the change of government, there is the risk that a lot of the momentum that's been built up over the last 3 or 4 years could be lost. And I think we've been trying to work with the private sector here, the bigger companies, and just the last 3 or 4 years, they've invested huge amounts in decarbonising what they do, looking into sustainable alternatives. And so I would hope that some of that momentum is kept up, I guess, as it would be most important kind of point.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think that's a valid point. I mean, it's whenever you ever change a government, there's always a concern that they might change direction a bit too radically sometimes.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, look, I'd just like to say in closing, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me, Sam. It's been a great conversation.
Great pleasure. Thank you, Steve, for inviting me to chat about this important topic. I always enjoy talking about it.
Thank you for listening to my podcast mini-series, A Penny for Your Thoughts on Sustainability. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. Like, share and follow for more episodes. Thank you.